Did that time. Beautiful. Hi everybody, I'm Fiona and we're back in the garage today to continue on with the drift build project. This week, slightly bigger one. It has been suggested quite strongly that I install a cooler on the power steering system because if the system gets too hot, obviously things start to fail, and we want to build a certain reliability into the drift car, I guess. It makes sense. But it has also been suggested to replace the serpentine belt driven power steering pump with an electric pump. So as probably the titles or the thumbnail suggests, that's what we're doing today. I've gone and bought and this is an automatic transmission cooler, still hydraulic fluid, does logically the same job, cheap from a pick apart. And this is an electric Astra based reserve and electric pump all in one. To connect it all together, I have numerous bits of piping that I've collected from varying transmission and power steering lines, and what I'm going to do is just bend them logically without kinking them, and then just join some of the pipes with some of these little flare join type connectors. Okay, so this is the electric power steering pump. This comes out of an Astra 98 through to about 2006, and we're over 2 different models. Very common, made by Opel in Europe but sold around the world. Locally they're a Holden Astra. And just a few things on this pump. The first one is that the high pressure fluid comes out here and then runs down this pipe. I've grabbed that bit of pipe. My plan is just to connect that high pressure line with a joiner to some pipe that I have, rather than mucking around with the connector. Secondly, the pump has 3 little rubber mounts, a little bit like a mini engine mount. I also did grab the cradle that the pump was sitting in, so then by doing that I can mount that in there. It'll cut down on vibration and hopefully some of the noise. Wiring wise, there are 2 thick wires. The brown one is for the ground or chassis, or neutral negative, whichever way you want to say it, but most people call it negative or chassis wire. It's a fairly thick gauge, as you can see. And then the positive power, which you need to run via a fairly chunky fuse to the battery. I would suggest probably something like a 50 amp would be about right, considering the gauge, and that may vary, but we'll see how we go with that down the line. There are 3 wires that actually then control the pump, turn it on and off. My understanding is that if we connect 2 of those 3 wires to a 12 volt source, the blue and black ones together, if we just join those and connect them to a 12 volt source, that will then fire up this pump, and that the last remaining wire, which is a brown one, does nothing. So we just terminate that, shield it, and we're done. Okay, so first thing to do, I think, is just to mock up how everything's going to be mounted, and then we can work out how everything's going to be plumbed, and then once that's done, probably pull it apart, plumb it, and then put it back together. See how we go, eh? Hi everybody, so it's the next day. I did keep working last night, but I just wasn't feeling great, so I didn't film any of it. Today it's all about mounting up the pump and wiring it up and get it all running. But let me just catch you up with what I've done so far. Okay, so we have our cooler mounted there, and the lines run through a nice little spot on the side there. And then those lines run through. Now this one's just loose at the moment, but the other line runs down to a joiner, which then runs down a hard line. And this is what I've done, is I've installed some hard lines down through until up to the steering rack. You can see there's an actual join there before the rack. You see that? Yep. So that's what I've done. I just ran hard lines down to the rack, and then running those lines, one of course the feed and one the return. The feed line has a nice little loop in it, but then just runs up to the end of a pipe at the moment. That only leaves today to mount up the bracket to hold the electric power steering pump, to then plumb that in and wire it up. Okay, so that's it's pretty secure there. It's not going to go anywhere too quick. So we'll put the power steering pump in that, and again this has got the little mounting little rubbers just to mount it with. I think partly to remove vibration, keep it a bit quieter. So we'll put that in there. We've just got 3 little screws to put together, and then well, you can see already that that's just going to go in there with a clamp. That's an easy one. So you might have noticed that the hard line I've run already pretty much exactly matches onto the joiner I have there. I was playing with this last night. I did actually do something, and it took a long time. What I need to do logically now is to do the last and final connection of this onto there. So I've cut the end off. It matches it exactly, and it's just touching it, and it's almost perfectly straight. Okay, so this is a flaring tool I have. This is just really a clamp. Clamps at both ends, just with some wing nuts on the pipe. And then that doesn't have to be there. It needs to be on the line. Most people just leave it down the bottom. I actually find it's easier to put it at the top because it gives you an idea about how far you need to flare it. It doesn't get in the way there. And then, of course, this is just an average sort of everyday sort of clamping mechanism. You just wind it in like a vice, and then if you can see it there, it's just got a cone. Just basically literally forces it into a cone shape to flare out the end. There we go. So then that flare goes on there, and then with it straight, because being straight is important, we can then do that up, and then with a proper tighten, that will be sealed. And then we finally come back into this one, which if we just quite literally slide a little clamp on there, and then push her up onto here. And with a clamp, we're done. Plumbing wise, still got the electrics. I'm going to actually leave this off though, because when I first run this, it's still got the existing fluid in it. So I'm going to run that into a bucket initially, and then flush the line. Okay, so the wiring, well, I put the ground in, just ran it to the chassis of the car. I don't know if you can quite see that. Pretty simple, straight to the chassis. I couldn't help myself but fill up and run some fluid through the system. I ended up connecting the return line, and just the constant power, I just very temporarily run it over to the battery. And I've got the battery charger running on that at the moment, just because the car's not running, so I don't want to drain the battery just for running this. But with all that plugged in, if we connect again the black and the blue, there's a brown wire as well that does nothing, goes nowhere. But if we connect the black and the blue onto this positive, so you can hear it spools up, and then it must have some sort of pressure system because it slows down after a bit. But with that running and the system bled, none of my joins are leaking. They're all dry, which is awesome. There's no seepage anywhere. Okay, so we ran the ground wire just down to the chassis, the positive feed and activation. I've just run them through a bit of conduit. It comes out here exposed. The red one, the main power feed, and little blue one to activate. They run all the way around. The red one via a fuse to the battery, and the blue one taps into one of the circuits in the fuse box. I don't actually know which one it is, but it doesn't really matter. It comes on with the ignition so that the pump activates with ignition. I'll update that all later, so it doesn't really matter right now. It's just something to make it work. Alright, key in. Turn it on. Yep, that's spun up. Sweet. I might even try and give this thing a start. Okay, so my research mods are good for a beginner in drifting, and one of the mods that was heavily suggested, just so that I don't break the car, was to put a cooler on the power steering system. So I've done that, and I've gone one step further and put an electric power steering pump in while I was at it, and hopefully that will help the car last longer when I'm drifting. You see the well-built diff, not just a weldy. The hard lines electric power steering pump. See what I'm going for here? I'm trying to make this drift car actually last a little bit better and not just fall apart on me straight away. Anyway, so that's 2 mods done now, power steering pump and cooler. Next week I would be back in the garage, but I'm not actually. Next week's Drift X, and I'll be helping out. So if you see me around helping out or doing something, I'm very approachable. Come and say hi. I'd love to know if anyone actually watches these locally. Otherwise, the week after that we'll be back in the garage for the next mod. Hope you're having a great day. We'll see you later. Bye.